Little pregame, right?
Yeah, we're a little pregame. All right, so we're live. Lester is here. We're going to do a little pregame here. So those of you that are watching this, on Monday or 5 weeks from now or whatever, we're just going to start off these live streams with a little pregame. Robert is finishing up the Baylor game. He says it's not over yet, although I would say that if you're down by 7 in a basketball game with 3 seconds left,
It's over.
that's over. So
Wrap it up.
I think he's going to take some time to get over a Baylor loss, considering that they won the championship last year. This is only the second round. I don't care about basketball. I don't care hardly anything about it. I haven't really cared since Jordan stopped playing. What about you? Do you care anything about basketball?
I'll be honest. I have not watched the NCAA tournament on purpose in about, I can't remember the last time. I was at a bar one time and it happened to be on. Otherwise, I just haven't watched. I can't get into it. I'm just too busy. Life gets in the way of a lot of stuff, and I prioritize my sports viewing to the National Football League at this time. I will watch some Bulls, some NBA on occasion, occasional Blackhawks if they make the playoffs. And baseball is kind of iffy. I'm a Tigers fan, so I don't get a lot of Tigers games where I live.
Yeah. I like baseball. It's like I love football. I like baseball. I don't care about the other sports. I can watch a basketball game if it's on, but I don't know anything about hockey. So we're going to add Robert in. Robert, welcome. Condolences to your Baylor Bears. We launched the live stream saying that you were in some sort of denial, down 7 with 3 seconds left, and you're like, it's not over.
I'm watching on Hulu though. You got to remember. So the live is about 45 seconds behind. So at the time it was down 5. Maybe they were going to assess 3 foul shots. And at that point they'd come back from 25. But look, guys, the weirdest part about transferring from basketball to football is that in football, Eddie Jackson can get hurt and it makes a huge difference. And he's 1 out of 11. And in basketball, Baylor had 3 major injuries and then 2 more
so there's
half
excuses
injuries
built in for losing to an 8 seed. Okay, all right.
Look, we hit the point where the announcers weren't even calling it into question. There was no disbelief in the room when they were up 20 in the first place. So maybe they just sold me on it at the end, but I feel like Baylor acquitted themselves just fine with the rally. And at the end of the day, they won a national championship last year. So in the world of basketball, I don't know, if the Bears won a Super Bowl, they could probably go 2-12 or 2-15 for 5 years in a row. And I would still gloat about that 2023 season. So they've got plenty of runway. Do you realize Dallas Mavericks fans are still gloating about one 2011 title? Championships are weird, man. And the Bears could use one,
We're Bears fans, Robert. We have 85. Some of the guys like me
still gloating. Speaking of,
it's all good. It's all good. That's sports, though. That's sports. If you get a title, you hold on to that ring and you wait for the next one. Unfortunately for the Bears, it's been way too long since the last one. So let's see if that changes here in the Ryan Poles era.
I was alive. But I didn't watch it. I was probably sat in front of the TV.
How old were you when 85?
Would have been 2 years old.
Just fake it. Pretend you were there. Who knows?
I don't want to. Look, as a historian, I respect it. I like learning about it. I like watching the clips. I like watching the games. I like reading the characters. They're very interesting. All of that. And I've gotten a chance to interact with one, the Otis Wilson, when I read his book and, got to interview him, and that was cool. It's a history thing for me, right? Yeah. It's honestly, it's as real as reading about Bronco Nagurski and Red Grange and Sid Luckman from, the 20s, 30s and 40s, right? It's the same to me because I didn't really live it. And I just want my own. Whereas I feel a much greater connection to Urlacher, Brown, Tommy Harris, Devin Hester, Charles Tillman, Matt Forte, right? Guys like that. I feel, I really lived and breathed those teams. So
speaking of Jeff, because before we dive into obviously 2022 Bears free agency, at some point, I have to mention So when you're young and you don't know anything about football, and like your dad can pick a holding call out of the melee that happened on screen, and you're like, oh my gosh, amazing, right? Like I was in 7th grade when the Bears went to the Super Bowl. And so I thought winning by defense and special teams, like that really was the formula. It was like defense, special teams, and Thomas Jones was like normal. And even going back and watching any games from like 2009 to 2010 or a little further back in the past, it's crazy that that team existed even then. Like, I can't believe it looking back that they actually got as far as they did. And then Devin Hester does the unthinkable to kick the Super Bowl off. I mean, like, it was a storybook season. To your point, Jeff, sometimes I almost feel like we don't memorialize enough the recent Bears team that went to the Super Bowl, because as soon as we do that, everybody just gets mad about Grossman and Thomas Jones not getting carries again. And I get it, right? Like, RIP Cedric Benson, there's a lot of negativity around that team as far as like the fact that they didn't win. But looking back, it's amazing what they accomplished without a quarterback, you know?
I mean, it was a great year, and I will say that as a 7th grader, I was the one in the room full of adults calling out the holding call, because that was the kind of annoying kid that I was, and my family was not exactly the ones that understood the nuances of what we were watching. But you guys missed Rundown, so I will do that in front of this live audience before we launch the podcast. So
we got to do it at the start of the show, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to tell you, but I'm going to save the banners for Lester so that he can react.
Oh, nice. The banners, fancy.
So we'll do a little intro. We'll start with the lines, the Trench tribute. So,
are we doing those this time? I'm
not really.
Okay.
We're keeping the trenches.
Okay.
We're going to start with the trenches. So we'll talk about Ogunjobi, and we'll talk about the offensive line for a while. Then I want to talk about the wide receivers. I want to talk about Nicholas Morrow. And then I want to talk about the 3 former Bears that just signed contracts. And then we'll get out of here for the pod, and then we'll take some Q&A.
There is some breaking news here that just happened like 10 minutes ago, too, with the Bears.
Best signing.
The 1 year? Yeah, okay.
Best signing.
You can bring it up if you want. I'm not going to make its own banner. So
that's okay. No banners needed for that one.
You guys good?
We're ready to rock.
All right. Welcome to Bear and Balanced. I'm Jeff Berckes, a writer for Windy City Gridiron. I'm joined by my co-host, the boss over at that fine website, Lester A. Wiltfong Jr. Lester, how's the first week of free agency treating you?
I really like what Ryan Poles is doing. I'm sure I'm in a bit of a minority, because a lot of Bears fans are kind of angst over the lack of star power. But this is a reset this season, and I'm actually excited for some of these names. I mean, there's like I said, there's no star power, there's no big flashy, wide receiver 1, but I like the slow and steady approach, letting the market come to them.
Yeah, I agree. And we're bringing on our producer for our third party here today, Robert Schmitz, who just watched his Baylor Bears fall in a heartbreaker in the second round. I am so sorry that your basketball team is out of it, but now you can focus fully on the rest of free agency and the NFL draft. Robert, how you doing?
I'm excited to be here. Like you said, getting off the production side of things and getting into talk about free agency. I mean, we've been doing some form of free agency pod for basically the whole, the first couple major days of free agency. We had to do a wrap up at some point. I'm just excited I get to be a part of it.
Well, and it's still going to hopefully keep going, right? Ryan Poles has a lot of work left to do. There's a lot of interesting names left on the board. And I think, to Lester's point, what I like about what Ryan Poles has done for the most part is that he has tried to let the market come to him. He knows that he does not have to fix this team in 1 year, and it's not going to happen. And so in order to make those dollars stretch as far as they can, he's going to have to remain firm and where he's at. So he's let the market, for the most part, come to him. And I think that's a pretty good sign for a big change at the top for the Bears. And so that's something to really, really be happy about. Our show, Bear and Balance, always starts in the trenches. And so I want to start talking about specifics with the Larry Ogunjobi saga. So what happened here was that the first signing that Ryan Poles announced was that he had signed this 3 technique late of the Cincinnati Bengals. 3 years, $40.5 million. So pretty big number there. $26 million of that was going to be guaranteed. So it was a nice contract for a player who was had for relatively cheap last offseason. After the official free agency started, so that was during the legal tampering period or the unofficial start of free agency, whatever you want to talk about it. He shows up at Hallis Hall for his physical. He's coming off a foot injury. He fails the physical, according to the team doctors. When he gets to Hallis Hall, the Bears pull the plug. So he is not a Chicago Bear. That contract was never signed, did not happen. The agreement is pending a physical. He did not pass said physical, and so that contract was rescinded and does not count. Here's the situation. I want to talk about this. One, what did you think of the contract when it happened? Two, what do you think about if there's any issue at all that Ryan Poles said, okay, we're gonna back out of this contract because the physical has failed? And three, where do you think this puts Eberflus's defense without the 3 technique? Robert, do you want to start us off?
I do. So at the time, it looked like a pace contract to me. I didn't say that out loud because I thought honestly that was too. I don't know. I don't want to be a hot takesman when it comes to these kinds of things, right? And there are way more people than just me. I'll point to plenty of the Bears media that will whine in my place about any move that the Bears make, unfortunately. So being part of the throng that said, giving a guy who was really high in pressures, but pretty bad on a down-to-down rate, like not a great run stuffer, not a good pass rusher when he didn't get home, because there are like intangibles, if you will. There is such thing as losing a pass rush, as in like you gave the quarterback an open rushing lane, you lost contain, you gave up way too much space. Like there are ways to make your line worse, or ways, better put, to not pressure the quarterback but still help as a pass rusher. And Ogunjobi was a victim of when he wasn't winning, he was losing very, very often. And the money that he was being paid, 2 years guaranteed, about $26.5 million if memory serves, and a $40 million total price tag, meant it wasn't if he's good. He has to be good for this contract to be worthwhile. So I'm super conflicted, because on one hand, a young man who has played his heart out and obviously done a ton for the game, like spent his whole life for this, just lost life-changing money. And I don't really want to celebrate that, so to speak. But the deal wasn't one that excited me in the first place. The best thing about it was that the Bears didn't have to draft a 3 technique, and it felt like an olive branch, not that they needed one, for a gift, a let's get to work gift from Ryan Poles to Matt Eberflus, who may very well now look for options in the draft for that important 3 technique spot. The problem was, and I'm curious to hear if you guys feel the same way, I don't know if Ogunjobi was going to be DeForest Buckner ever. And he was paid like he was going to approach that level of play, at least play a similar dominance role. And I think that you could find a better player fit.
You know, I talked about it on Robert's show earlier in the week. We kind of jumped on that for the first day, and we both talked about it. It seemed like an overpay, but that's free agency. When you the first couple of days of free agency, you're going to overpay. They wanted to make sure they had a guy that they felt could play that all important 3 technique in this defense. And as we know, as Bears fans, we saw it back in the day. You know, the 3 technique is the engine that powers the Tampa 2 style defense. So they had to get a guy they trusted in that spot. Again, an overpay. His tape is inconsistent, but he flashes. He has the first step quickness they want. So Matt Eberflus obviously thought he was the guy. Ryan Poles thought he was the guy. And look, these things happen with the contract. You know, this isn't the first time a guy failed the physical and the trade was taken off the board or the contract was taken away. But like you guys alluded to, some in Chicago media took this stuff personal. Like, how dare Ryan Poles have this happen to him? Like, they're trying to make it like a big thing. You know, they spoke prior to the contract offer being out there. The Bears obviously thought his rehab was further along than it was. Once they had a chance to look at him and get him, you know, in the building for a physical, he didn't pass the physical. It happens. It's not a big deal. There is no need to have a press conference. A press release was sent out. As far as I'm concerned, again, it sucks for the player. It sucks for the Bears. It was a bad situation, but they quickly moved on. I guess the timeline was kind of like the day before the presser, they had the whole the physical, because they were on the phone with the backup plan quickly. Justin Jones, defensive tackle from the Chargers, he's in. He's the new 3 technique. Let's play.
Yeah, you know, some of the some people in media seemed to take it personally that Ryan Poles wasn't going to come out and basically apologize. Some were calling it a clumsy start out of the gates, and some people were calling it a shows his inexperience and all this kind of. And it was like, what are you? You are thirsty for something here. You are thirsty to try to develop some sort of story here. This is a non-story. This happens. This happens to everybody. This happens to Bill Belichick. This happens to John Schneider. This happens to everybody. This is just something that happens in the NFL. It is not something to get all worried about. And honestly, it's unfortunate just because it's the first thing. And like Robert said, young man, life-changing money, and just circumstances where he wasn't along in his rehab enough to be able to cash in on that. I hope for him that he finds a good place to play this year and is able to get that big contract in the future. They did pivot to Justin Jones, as you mentioned, a nice run stopping defensive tackle, has a little explosion out of that 3 technique, a little bit more known for run stopping ability and not necessarily taking down the passer. 2 years, $12 million. So a much more palatable number to those that were a little heartbroken over the 345. Former 3rd round pick from the Chargers, missed some games over his career with some injuries, but overall, a smaller, maybe safer signing that doesn't necessarily have that ability or that potential to really disappoint fans. This is a guy that can come in and play right away.
And I know I could be reaching a little bit, JB, but part of me can't help but wonder if after all the injuries that we've seen the Bears take over the last few years, Ryan Poles, look, the physicals, what I understand, because I reached out to a couple of people, is that teams' physicals, like what constitutes a pass and what constitutes a fail, is not NFL mandated. That's not to suggest that the Bears changed their mind. Do not go down that road, because it's not what I'm saying. It's more to say that there are some guys who they'll take a look at a knee and they'll say, okay, it's like a medium high risk, but they're a great player, so we're going to pass them along. And maybe given that they cut Goldman, they cut Tariq Cohen, maybe they just aren't having it right now, and that they want healthy guys, which for somebody like, Justin Jones, who has been injured in the past, or the obvious interest that we keep hearing about Terran Armistead, that says something about what the Bears think, like their medical staff thinks of those players. We'll see. But at the end of the day, I'm really caught right now, and I'm sure plenty of fans are, between cap space doesn't win games. So just because they got out of a potential overpay contract doesn't mean it's somehow a win. The team got worse, right? But also they've got more space. And in a season where the Bears are 40 million dead cap, which is typically a killer for any NFL football team, and they need to continue investing on the offense, losing out on a big defensive contract, I don't know. I end up wondering if down the line we will be looking back saying, if only we had a Larry Ogunjobi, that would have been it.
The way I look at the signing with Larry Ogunjobi, like you said, you mentioned the contract deals. That was essentially only a 2-year deal, because after the second year, there is no more guaranteed money. So regardless of what they did this offseason at that 3-tech spot, that was still going to be a 1 or 2 year stopgap. They're still going to at some point draft their guy, and it's going to happen probably not this offseason, but probably next offseason. They're going to look for a young stud at that spot, because it's an important part of the defense. So the Bears are, like I said, they got a little worse by losing what is perceived on paper to be a better player. His film looks to be a little better, but again, inconsistent. So with Justin Jones, he has to stay healthy. He's not the same explosive athlete that the Bears signed originally, but I think he's a quality upgrade, and he will help that defense.
Well, let's flip it over to the offensive line. So there's a lot of talk that we've had on the offensive line. There's a lot of angst happening amongst Bears fans for this offensive line to not be filled at this point. But let's talk about the first acquisition. So Lucas Patrick signs a 2-year, $8 million contract with $4 million guaranteed. Basically, that means he's going to be on the roster this year. It is amazing. This guy looks like a doppelganger of one of my former colleagues and friends. His name's Steve, and they look like dead ringers for each other. Height, weight, and face and beard, it's all the same. It's kind of crazy. At good Midwestern roots, I guess. But it's basically top interior offensive line backup money, or low level guard starter money. This is not some big contract. This is a contract to give Ryan Poles some flexibility here. And he said that the Bears told him that they envisioned a plan for him at center. And so everybody has kind of run with that. I'm not convinced that that story is over. They do not have their best 5 that they're going to put on the field yet. It gives Poles some flexibility. I could see him playing center. I could see him playing right guard. I could see him being the top backup and backing up both center and guard positions. So I don't put a ton of stock into that press conference yet. But what do you think of this signing? Obviously connected to offensive coordinator Luke Getzy. Lester, where are you at with Lucas Patrick?
This signing makes so much sense. I think he comes in, he'll understand the scheme, he'll know what Luke Getzy wants to do on offense, and he does play the game with a nasty demeanor. I mean, he's a guy that fits what Ryan Poles envisioned for his offense, especially for his old line. Athletic, nasty. This guy fits that. And like you said, the money, it's starter money, so he'll be starting somewhere along that line. But if something happens in the draft, if a player comes loose in free agency and it's a better center, so to speak, I can't see the Bears turning it down. I mean, as Bears fans, we saw this situation play out a few years back. Josh Sitton was cut loose by the Packers. They signed him and immediately moved Cody Whitehair to center. Things happen with organizations. There is no set in stone. This is your guy, this is your spot, especially with a guy like Patrick, who has shown he can start at guard and at center. He has a lot of starts the last 2 years. This is a great signing for the Bears. He will help stabilize that line, whether it's at center or guard. I think, center right now makes the most sense. But like you said, who knows what happens?
Well, let's say that Ryan Poles does get J.C. Tretter, who was let go by the Browns, so that they could make room for some other enormous contract that we're not going to touch on in this episode because we're not a Browns podcast. But they let him go. Now after all of the top available centers gobbled up, good contracts, J.C. Tretter is now on the market. So if Ryan Poles, who now has more money back in his pocket because of the Ogunjobi money coming back, if he was able to bring in J.C. Tretter, is that something that interests you, Robert? Is that something that you can see bringing in a veteran presence like Tretter? And I will mention that, we like to make these connections. J.C. Tretter and Luke Getzy were both in Green Bay for 3 years. That's where Tretter started his career. So there is a connection there with the offensive coordinator.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I was on the big money center train before free agency. And so Tretter made tons of sense when he got cut, where it was like, the Bears missed on all the center. No, they didn't. Somebody's still on the market. But at the same time, as I watched the tape, I mean, Lucas Patrick he ended up scoring a 9.3 relative athletic score. That's RAS, which is done by Kentley Platt, who not only has been on a couple of our podcasts, but me and JB got to meet him out at the Senior Bowl, which was really cool. So he's an athletic guy that comes from a UDFA background. And if there's anything weirder in free agency, or frankly, the NFL in general, than like pedigree and the way that it sticks with a player throughout their entire career, I don't know what it is. There's nothing that tamps down on somebody's market, just like Bradley Bozeman out in Ravensville, and the way that he's been treated across the league throughout this free agency period. When you've got a UDFA player, a lot of times you can get them for cheaper than maybe they should be. And so who's to say that a center, which is largely a mental position from what I understand. Obviously, you need physical gifts, but the centers that are really good separate themselves by how they coordinate the line. Who's to say that something that intangible would drive your market up without any proof? I don't know. So the point that I guess I'm working my way around to is I get the impression that, like Lester said at the top of the show, Ryan Poles has submitted an offer for Tretter. He's submitted an offer for Ryan Bates. He's submitted an offer for Terran Armstead. He's submitted an offer for Lyle Collins. And right now he's just waiting to see how the market bears out. That he's not rushing to get his guy the way that a certain other Ryan PGM that we don't need to talk about anymore.
Conviction.
Used to handle everything, right? That it can be frustrating. I'm frustrated a little bit sometimes. I keep going back and forth. We all care, right? But I remind myself that I just don't think Ryan Poles is trying to act like any specific player is the fix for an offensive line when honestly, right now, chances are every single player on the offensive line is under evaluation for both performance and position, that they could move half these guys to a brand new spot just because they think that they'd do better there.
You heard it here first. Robert thinks that Tevin Jenkins is going to be the new center. Just kidding.
It's the obvious fit. I'm kidding.
So I reached out to one of my frenemies, Matub on Twitter, and I asked about, he's the Acme Packing Company guy, and I asked about Lucas Patrick, and I said, hey, how many snaps did Lucas Patrick take at center? This guy's mostly a guard, right? And he said he's supposed to be a guard, but can play center in a pinch. If he's your starting center, then you don't have a lot of good options. He's a quality swing interior offensive lineman, and that's exactly how the Bears played him. And he says, and you can quote me on that. So I'm not sharing. No. Yeah, I quoted him on that. I'm not sharing it out of school here. So, and then he had very nice things to say about Treader, who started in Green Bay. So, I think it provides Poles with a lot of flexibility in the remaining moves that he wants to make, whether that be in the draft or bringing somebody else in, because it gives him a fungible asset that he can move around. But I'm not convinced that he's going to be the center on, opening day. That's just where I'm at. I'm not going to believe anything until I actually see, the starting lineup roll out there. Let's just, you mentioned Teron Armstead. You pronounce it very differently than I do. Pronounce La'el Collins. You haven't mentioned Eric Fisher, but I think we should certainly mention him since he spent a lot of time in Kansas City. He spent last year in Indianapolis, so he would know the major parties there. There is a real chance that Ryan Poles does land one of these tackles. What do you guys think? What's your preference on this, given injury history, given potential contracts of those three guys? What do you think is possible, and who are you kind of cheering for here? Lester, start with you.
For me, I'd be fine with any of those guys. It all depends on what you want to do. Because with Fisher, he's a left tackle. Collins probably going to be a right tackle. Armstead obviously is a left tackle. So, depending on what you do with those spots, you got to figure out where you're going to do with Tevin Jenkins, Larry Bourne to some degree also. But I'd be fine with all three of them. I think all three have some stuff left in the tank. Let's get them in Chicago, because the Bears, they need at least one more quality starter to come in to really help put this line where they want to be, because right now there's still some holes on the O-line.
Like with any free agent, all of them have a red flag, right? Armstead. Did you say it's Teron Armstead?
I think it's Teron Armstead.
But
I could be wrong.
I'm
not saying you're wrong.
Right.
I'm just saying I'm not sure. Like when someone pronounces something differently than me, I think, well, wait, am I saying? I just wanted to.
Anybody who's played the Bears in the preseason has mentioned the name E.A. Booneway, but they've probably pronounced it very differently, especially if they come from pronunciation can be tough. But anyways, Armstead, obviously, there's the health question. With Collins, you've got the suspension question, not the health question. And with Fisher, you'll get a cheaper player, but there's both injury and performance risk. At the end of the day, right now, the Bears offensive line is so full of straight up holes. Like we could be kinder if we wanted to be, but I think any of these guys is such a massive upgrade over the person currently holding the spot that I would take any of them. And I am one who gets nervous about risk. So big deals, whether it's Ogunjobi, whether it's Armstead, like whoever it would be, I get nervous that any player who's over 25 and already has any injury risk is going to just end up hurt. Kind of like Khalil Mack did in Chicago, because it's a very common story. It's not to say, you get the idea. But the value that a tackle like Armstead could bring is so obvious that if that ends up being the signing and it's a ton of money for a really good player, it's something I'll be able to talk myself into at the very least. So I'm ready for the highest, and I'm ready for Fisher, the bargain. And Collins, the suspension question worries me, but I don't know. I'm not as familiar as a Dallasite should be.
I think Collins will probably cost a pretty penny as well. So
I
think I would take Armstead, even though he has had trouble staying on the field. And Fisher doesn't excite me as much, but he would be a solid presence, and he has familiarity with both Eberflus and he has familiarity with Ryan Poles. And so that could be a pretty interesting fit in certainly if they miss out on Armstead. If Armstead signs somewhere else, I could see the Bears shifting focus to him and that being the next thing that we hear about. So, well, let's move on to, let's stay on offense and let's move on to the wide receiver room. And I want to talk about the two signings so far. So Equiminius St. Brown, there was a Luke Getzy guy, obviously from Green Bay. He will know what Getsy's trying to do. He'll bring in some of that. We were expecting some sort of Green Bay wide receiver to come over. This is the cheaper option. So much so that we don't know the details of the contract, which tells me that it's probably pretty close to the veteran minimum. The other signing here is Byron Pringle, which obviously would be someone that Ryan Poles knows well, comes from the Kansas City system there. He signs a 1-year, $6 million contract with $4 million guaranteed. So clearly he's going to be assured a roster spot here. I got a couple of messages, text messages from some friends that are Kansas City fans. They're like, you're going to love Pringle. You're going to love him. And my personal story is like years ago, I think he was a rookie or second year guy. I went to a Chiefs game. I went to 2 Chiefs games that year. And this guy was wearing a Pringle jersey. And I'm like, is that his name? Is that like this guy? Does this guy like Pringles? Like, what's happening here? I didn't know it was a real player. And then he's like on the field and he's making plays. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I got to learn about Byron Pringle like on his breakout day because this guy in front of me was wearing a Pringle jersey. But what do you guys think of these two moves? These are not, market setting moves. These are not wide receiver ones. But what do you guys think of these two players and what role do you see them playing on this roster?
So it's not that I think Pringle's a superstar or St. Brown, but when I'm seeing talk on whether it's Windy City Gridiron or Twitter or just about any Bears social media, people talk about the wide receiver room as if it's absolutely atrocious. And it is. I am not about to sell you that it's not, but it's as if they're forgetting that last year's wide receiver room was as awful as it was. I think Pringle is a better player than Marquise Goodwin. And I think St. Brown is a better player than Damiere Byrd. They're different, but while cheap, they're upgrades. Even if you're moving from like a D to a D plus in some of these categories, because St. Brown is not somebody who's like going to get me super excited, but the Bears need whatever support that they can get for Justin Fields right now. And wide receiver help is not coming cheap, suffice it to say. So a $4 million deal that can become a $6 million deal with incentives for a guy who picked up 500 yards on the Chiefs is something that I can certainly get behind. I don't think St. Brown is a name that Bears fans need to like remember, because I don't think he's going to end up being a key piece. Won't surprise me if they're clearly keying up to take a receiver high in the draft. The question is whether they're keying up to take 2 receivers high in the draft. And to me, that means that you have to pigeonhole a top 50 pick at receiver and address the room from there.
You know, I see the same comments about how bad this Bears receiver room is. But the one thing a lot of fans are forgetting is Matt Nagy no longer is calling the plays. You know, it's all projection at this point. But the Luke Getzy offense should be able to get more out of these guys than what we would have seen had it still been Matt Nagy's, 50 curl routes a damn game type of offense he has here. St. Brown is a speedster. He's a 4.4 speed guy. He's similar to Marcus Valdez-Scantling, but he obviously comes at a much lower price tag. And if you look at his career in Green Bay, started on a practice squad a little bit. He had some time on the main roster in Green Bay. And if Aaron Rodgers does not trust you, he will not throw you the ball very often. And from what I understand from some guys that I know that cover the Packers, St. Brown had some issues early on. He kind of got, I'm not going to say he got in Aaron Rodgers' doghouse, but he didn't look to him all the time. So he has legit speed. He's 6'5". He's a big target. I think he'll help the Bears offense, but this is not the A-Rob replacement. This is a 4th or 5th wide receiver that can play some special teams, and he will be able to do that for you as well. More like a Josh Bellamy type, Bears fans. This is not a guy. He's not the guy coming in. Byron Pringle, though, is going to come in. He's going to either be your 2 or your 3. He can work out of the slot. He was 4th in targets for the Chiefs last year. He has some explosiveness. He has some production. He's going to be a player. He'll help out. You're going to get more out of Pringle in the Luke Getzy offense than what we saw last year with Marquise Goodwin or Byrd in the Nagy shenanigan crap that he pulled out of there every week.
And it's also worth mentioning that I think people forget how often free agent wide receivers fail to make an impact on their team beyond a negative one, given the contracts that people sign. When you look around the league, the receivers that are enjoying consistent success with their quarterback are the ones that were drafted, regardless of round, whether that's Tyler Lockett in the 7th, DK Metcalf in the 2nd, or obviously Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson in the 1st round. It seems as if you want to find receivers, you don't buy them in free agency, you draft them. And then you re-sign them and keep them on your team. So when I talk about drafting receivers and the state of the wide receiver room, it's not that I think that, I don't know, Christian Watson, George Pickens, as good as they may be, are going to come in and save the Bears receiver room. It's more to say that I don't think handing some 3-year deal to Juju Smith-Schuster or a massive contract to Christian Kirk would have made near the impact that the Bears could create with that same money at other positions. Does that, what do you think about that, JB?
Yeah, that I'm on board with you that I would have not gone after high-priced wide receiver free agents, and I would want to draft them. I've already spoken to my hope that Ryan Poles is going to use at least one, if not two, of his day 2 picks on wide receiver and sort of stay out of that market. A lot of Bears fans were talking about Christian Kirk. I had no interest. A lot of Bears fans talking about MVS. I didn't have an interest in that because I thought his market was going to be too much, and for what he is. And so you have a guy like Byron Pringle, who probably was overshadowed by all the great weapons that Kansas City had. Now he gets a chance to maybe have more targets, be more productive, but you're asking him to be behind or after Darnell Mooney probably in the pecking order. So he's probably going to be wide receiver 3 in this. Equiminius St. Brown, I think, first of all, he's a Golden Domer, so a lot of Bears fans already know his name, so that they got that going for him. But I think he's providing that training camp value. He's providing that wide receiver room value in any kind of translation in that offense because he's going to be very familiar with what Getzy's bringing. So I think that he's providing a lot of value to the room. Maybe he's not going to show it on the field as much, but he's going to provide in the room and getting these guys ready. So I'm fine with both signings. I'm very happy with how Poles has addressed the wide receiver room so far because I didn't see the points of going after some of these guys that are getting wide receiver 1 money, who are wide receiver 2s and in Christian Kirk's case, maybe a wide receiver 3. I just don't get it. Jacksonville just likes to light, trunks of money on fire. And that's great for those guys that get that money, but that's not how I wanted my general manager to act. So I like what's happening here. Stick with them. Let's see what the other piece looks like. We'll see what the draft brings. We are going to live stream day 2 of the draft. So,
nice.
Make sure that you guys are following that because we are going to talk a lot about wide receivers. I've already got Jacob and Fonte on the hook to spend some time with us. The 3 of us are going to spend a lot of time as Lester's going to pop in and out. So teasing that now because that is going to happen. We are very excited about that. I'm going to take a quick break here for commercial, and we're going to come back. We're going to talk about some other stuff. All right, guys, we're back. So one of the other signings that maybe went under the radar a little bit, but I wanted to talk about this linebacking core. So one of the guys that's going to pair up with Roquan Smith here is Nicholas Morrow. So guy coming off an injury, didn't play last year, but was signed to the Raiders. Real athletic guy, pretty exciting guy. What do you know about him? What do you think about this Nicholas Morrow sighting?
I mean, he's from the Raider fans I've talked to, the guys that cover the Raiders that I've talked to, they like him. I mean, he's a good athlete. He was a former, I think, UDFA. Again, one of these guys that really worked his way up, and made his mark on the team. And, he has several starts. And the nice thing about him is he could start at all 3 linebacker spots, the Will, the Sam, and the Mike. So, again, another guy that gives the Bears options, not big money, but it is enough money where you probably figure he will start somewhere. So we'll see what happens. But, he's a legit 4.5 speed guy, another really good athlete, pretty good in coverage. And that's what you want these days. These days, you need a linebacking core that can cover. I mean, it's a passing league. It has been for a while now. So he's a guy that can come in with Roquan, and it gives him a good athlete to get after things.
I can't help but feel like right now they're linebacking. It's not just their depth, but their linebacking situation's a bit of a mess. It's not Morrow's fault. It's more that they had Roquan Smith and they had just about nobody else for a defensive head coach that likes a very particular type of linebacker that's hard to find outside of the draft. So a signing like Morrow to me makes tons of sense. You've got to get a stopgap in place for as much as plenty of people, me included, would say that I'd love to see the Bears prioritize offense over defense. You can't start Kendall Vildor this year. Like, you can't just take whoever. You can't start a UDFA next to Eddie Jackson. You have to have some kind of defender or like defense out there that your coach can then work with. Morrow seems like you're talking about Lester, like a perfectly solid player that can play all sorts of spots. If anything, who knows? Maybe we'll see Roquan not playing the Will after all and playing the Mike, which is more on the passing strength side of the field where you could get a little bit more value out of him so that he doesn't get taken away by the running back quite as often. But we will see. I mean, it's not as if, from my understanding, Eberflus has come out and made any comment one way or another that solidifies where Roquan's going to play. So a versatile linebacker that can be trusted in the finer points of the game to at least do his job makes tons of sense for the money they paid for him.
Yeah, and I think that's how you have to look at it. It's a 1-year contract. It's a lower money contract. There's not a lot of risk involved here, but it gives Ryan Poles, gives Matt Eberflus the ability to move this guy around, gives him options. Not only does it give him an option in how he ends up playing him and what it looks on the field, it gives you an option on who else you sign or who else you draft, right? If you are able to bring another guy in that you can't really see playing multiple positions, right? You know, this guy is a sandbacker and that's what he is. So we're going to move Morrow over to Mike and we're going to play Roquan at will or vice versa, right? That sort of flexibility is really nice in these low risk signings because, again, it's a fungible asset and you can move it around. So I think that's a good thing. Anybody want to talk about the most obvious signing, the defensive end from the Colts? Just, you know, everybody had penciled in as happening.
I guess what I'll say is this. So I think a lot of Bears fans wanted to see Quinn traded instead of Mac, going all the way back to the Mac trade. That Quinn being kept on, which I would tell you that I think that with an 18-sack season last year, clear Ben still in his game, coming off of injury, and obviously tons of production and a surprisingly affordable contract, that he's still a pretty good trade asset in and of itself. The signing Al-Qadim Muhammad that everybody pegged at the start of the offseason, that basically they said, if they're going to get anybody, they're going to get Al-Qadim Muhammad, gives them a little bit more flexibility at defensive end should they end up with somebody saying, hey, Quinn is the guy who puts us over the edge. We'll give you a second-round pick for him. So I like the signing because it gives them options. You keep using the phrase fungible asset, JB. I love it. You can't just trade both starting defensive ends with nobody behind them, but you can when you've got Travis Gibson, Al-Qadim Muhammad, and Jeremiah Atacho, who's still on the roster. Ataochu is still on the roster. They may like him more than we realize. And while it wouldn't be the Mac Quinn 1-2 punch that the Bears have had for years, I mean, there are a lot of players that they could target in the draft that would help them out more over the next 4 years than a guy like Quinn probably would. We will see. I know I talked more about Quinn than Muhammad himself. He's a very solid player, both in the run and in the passing game. But I can't help but think that this signing has more future impact than we realize.
Last year was his first year as a full-time starter. I think he had 7 sacks. So, you know, he's a good guy to come in. He is starter worthy, obviously. And like you said, this gives them option to trade Quinn. You know, I was talking to a former NFL scout, and he said that this signing, he believes now means that Quinn is either on the block or at least they'll listen to more offers now. And it does make sense, whether he's traded in the offseason or they wait and see what things shake out and then they do something at the trade deadline. Yeah. I think you can get him. I mean, if you could trade Quinn for a 3 or a 4, hell, even a 5 at this point. You know, this team is in the mode to reset. Get some draft picks in. You could find a guy in the draft. You could find a guy in the street. They can come in and play some edge for you. You know, and let's talk about last year's UDFA, Charles Snowden, who's still on the roster. I mean, he did flash as an edge in college. He had some injury issues. Who knows? Maybe he's a guy that can develop. We see it every year with the Bears. You know, there's that guy they get. The first year is kind of like the red shirt year. And then all of a sudden he comes in and he starts making a bit of an impact. So maybe they see something in Snowden as well.
I'll never forget David Bass, the UDFA edge rusher sensation that just hung around on the roster for way longer than I think anybody expected him to.
I think one of the things you're talking about there again is this term I use a lot. It's opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost of keeping Robert Quinn on the roster on a team that's probably not going to compete for anything that significant this year is not only the money that you're paying him, it's any sort of draft capital that you're foregoing that you could get in a trade. And it's the opportunity to see if guys like that can handle more reps, that guys like that can play in the league. It's evaluation time and meaningful reps, right? So Robert Quinn's a really good player. Robert Quinn is he's one of the better defensive ends in the league, particularly when he's healthy. And we saw that last year. He was excellent, right? So there are two times when this is going to potentially happen. One is before the draft or right during the draft. It would have to be if Ryan Poles can get draft capital right now so that he can help build this team. If you don't see it at that point, there's no sense in trading him until the season, until midway through the season, until the trade deadline. And then maybe you get that Von Miller-esque kind of deal because a team's going to be willing to afford that. And then that helps for next year's draft. But there's really those, it's not going to happen in June. It's going to happen either, pre-draft, during the draft, or it's going to happen around the trade deadline next year so that you can start building out that draft capital for 2023. So let's move on to some former Bears. I want to close the book a little bit on some guys that got deals. So three former Bears. Let's start with Allen Robinson. Signs a 3-year deal worth $45 million, 30.7 guaranteed with the LA Rams. Who had that? No. Who had Robinson signing with the Rams at the outset of free agency? But less money than it was reported that he was getting offered during the negotiations in the Ryan Pace regime. Significantly less. Let's put it that way. Contract talks stalled after some back and forth. He played out the year, played out the franchise tag, and entered a market. Obviously, signs with a team that's just won the Super Bowl and is obviously looking to run it back. What do you think about this contract? What do you think about the fit with the Rams? What do you think about what happened in the bad taste in the mouth with everything that went on in Chicago?
For me, I look at the Rams roster and, they'll find use for him because that's what they do. They have OBJ got injured. This move now has put Robert Woods potentially on the trade block, who was also injured last year. So, the Rams don't care, man. The Rams are going to load up. They're doing what it takes because they know they're in a window right now to compete. Still, with they have the quarterback in place. They have a Donald. They have some really good, solid veterans, and they want to win now. So they're going to do whatever it takes. We saw with the Von Miller trade a year ago. They'll do whatever it takes to win. And I think Allen Robinson, his numbers may not be what Bears fans saw in Chicago with, I think, 100 catch, 1,000 yards. He may not approach those numbers again, but it's a good spot for him. It's good money. He's on a team with a quarterback. He's on a team with a really good head coach. He's going to win. And as a fan of Allen Robinson's, I'm glad to see him land in a really good spot.
Mm-hmm. Good for Allen Robinson, good for the Rams, and more than likely, I don't want to say good for the Bears, like it's better that he leaves, but that last season, whether there was more injury concern than we realized coming out of COVID, or honestly just an effort problem, things ended so badly that I don't know how any coach would look at that tape and be like, we've got to bring this guy back. And so it's clean break. If there's anything that I'm going to beg the question on, I love Allen Robinson. I was stumping for him hard to get extended in Chicago, but Cooper Kupp is such an unbelievable weapon that I'm curious to see if diluting Kupp's target share is going to make the Rams offense dramatically better, because I love Allen Robinson as a weapon. I do think as he ages, he's losing the vertical threat that used to make him an all-tool wide receiver and slowly turning into, I don't want to call him a possession receiver, but I think you guys understand what I mean. So I want to know how McVay is going to use him. McVay's a really good coach, so I'm sure they'll figure it out, and Robinson's a really good player, but it won't surprise me if Robinson never breaks 1,000 yards again, just because as he moves into his new role, I think he's going to go from being a clear-cut top 15 wide receiver 1 down to a really, really good wide receiver 2. And it's just a little due to age, scheme fit, and how I guess I see it there.
Yeah, I think that with Kupp being the all-world performer that he is, he's going to continue to be the target hog. And then with Woods being hurt and then them signing OBJ at like the same time, right? Like they signed OBJ and then the next day in practice or some insane thing like that is when Woods went down. And then, of course, OBJ got hurt in the playoffs. So you have this uncertainty with the Rams receiving core, and Robinson gives you that certainty to be that number 2 to Kupp. It's a very nice number 2 receiver to have, just like Robert Woods was a nice number 2 receiver to have, just like OBJ was a nice number 2 receiver to have, right? They have put their chips on, let's give our quarterback premium weapons, which would be great to see Chicago follow suit and do something like that as well. I think that he'll be fine. I don't think that he'll be this amazing wide receiver 1 or anything like that. But, that contract's basically got him on the books for 2 years out of contender. And, Allen Robinson, I had him on, I got a chance to interview him. Very nice guy. He answered my questions. Seems like a technician. I really liked watching him play. This last year was very painful for me because I know how good of a player he is, and he clearly wasn't happy. And just wasn't on the same page with what was happening. And a lot of guys weren't on the same page with what was happening in Chicago. But it was just hard to see that because you know what his potential is. And you know that he could have been an all-time great Bear. He could have broken all of the Bears receiving records if he wanted them. Maybe not touchdowns, but like certainly could have gotten catches and yards if he would have stuck around for a while. But it's not to be. And those old wide receiver records are going to hang around for at least a little while more, a little while longer. Johnny Morris, you are safe. Walter Payton's reception record, it is safe, right? So let's move on to James Daniels, who didn't seem like he was very happy here either. But he signs with the Steelers, 3 years, $26 million, only 8.5 guaranteed. So not a great market for Daniels here. Does land in, I think, a really nice spot though. Good system. I think that he's going to be a good fit there. I know some Steelers fans that are very excited about landing Daniels because there's a big Hawkeyes Steelers overlap. And so know some happy people, but surprised at all that Daniels didn't seem like he was ever going to come back to Chicago. And what do you think of his fit there in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I am a little. I mean, that's, again, we talked about Daniels earlier in the week on one of the other shows, and a quality guy, very young, a lot of starts in the NFL. He fits the athletic profile that they want in the brand new scheme. But it just seems like he didn't have the right demeanor. I know that Ryan Poles talks about wanting a bunch of like really, dogs. He wants guys that will really get after it, really physical, and play that type of contest that way. Daniels is more mild-mannered. I mean, it's just who he is as a guy. Nothing wrong with it. It's just who he is. That's how he comes about it. And like you said, maybe he didn't want to stay in Chicago. Maybe there was an offer on the table because 8.5 or whatever it was, that's starting quality money that the Bears probably could have afforded had they wanted to bring him back. But it's at the end of the day, this is not a Ryan Poles draft pick. This is a Ryan Pace draft pick. Ryan Poles wants his guys, so he's rebuilding the O-line and the image he wants to see. And James Daniels didn't fit that.
Yeah, Daniels is awesome. I mean,
to
act like he's not would. I don't know. I just don't want to be the guy who's like, oh, Daniels, wrong attitude, never very good. Glad he's off the team. No, I mean, he got a great deal. If there's anything going on in Pittsburgh that I think is weird, JB, it's that they seem to be assembling a lot of offensive tools that cataclysmically failed over the last couple of years with Trubisky and Daniels and Anthony Miller. It's a lot of guys that I'm like, what's the method here? But Daniels was a nice like split zone, wide zone guard that could play a lot of different positions. The whole world seems to want to put him at center again, which I'll believe it when I see it. I mean, he was billed as an amazing center prospect, and I don't want to take that away from him. But in 2019, his center tape was so heinous that they just pushed Cody Whitehair back to the spot to try to salvage something in 2019. Overall, Lester, I think you nailed it. It comes down to demeanor. I think Poles wants guys that are just going to beat people up. I think he wants guys that are more Tevin Jenkins and less the mild-mannered James Daniels. And so he'll take a Lucas Patrick, who's got a little bit of nasty to him, over a James Daniels. And hey, when you're not trying to commit more money than you think players are worth to these different players, I get it. It makes sense to move on from both parties.
Yeah, I have a feeling that if Pittsburgh lines up Daniels with Trubisky under center, that my brain might just explode. That's the configuration. But I think he's probably going to slot in at guard. But I could be wrong. Hope for the best for James Daniels. I was excited to have a Hawkeye on the team. It's not, is no longer. Maybe there's another Hawkeye in the draft that could maybe get to the Bears at 39.
Centers do tend to slip a little bit.
They do. Everybody wants to put him in the first, but he's got short arms. Everybody avoid him. He's got short arms.
JB, you would bang that table, wouldn't you? If there was a great receiver and also good old Tyler sitting there at 39, where would your heart be?
Oh, there's more wide receivers that you can have a little later. Take the center now. Let's end it with Bilal Nichols. So he signs a 2-year, $11 million contract, $9 million guaranteed with the Raiders. Not surprised that he did not re-sign here because you're changing the scheme, and I'm not sure that it necessarily fit to bring him back. So good luck to Bilal. Nice player, never necessarily became a star that a lot of people were pegging him to be in the first couple of years, but nice get for the Raiders. Good addition to the O-line.
I will say Nichols really frustrated me over the last couple of years as a Bear. To use I don't know, to kind of boil it down, players, especially when they're young, have two choices. Are you going to get better at what you're bad at, or are you going to make what you're good at really good? And Nichols took a quick frame, a surprisingly spry ability to get to the passer and spring up at the start of the snap and just whiz by people, where he got most of his production from just being super fast, and got way better at his hand technique as his rookie year wore on. Suddenly came to camp as a sophomore, way more bulked up, a lot slower, like not super slow, but he wasn't bulky enough to 2-gap. He could 1-gap really well. So now he was good against the run in certain situations, but him, Quinn, and Roquan, whenever they lined up on one side of the field, would get a run call against them. The Bears couldn't do that in 2019 and 2020 because they'd give up 15, 20-yard gains consistently, way more consistently than they should. So I can't help but feel like Bilal Nichols got improper guidance somewhere along the lines, because I feel like he took what had made him so special in his rookie year and kind of cut or undermined himself in trying to be a well-rounded player. I'm happy for him. He got awesome money. He deserves it. But kind of like how we saw Roy Robertson Harris get signed by Jacksonville for a surprisingly big contract, I'm certainly not unhappy to see him go. And hopefully he returns the 5th-round pick that the Bears spent on him in compensatory selections in the future.
I think part of Bilal Nichols is he was moved around the line too much. He came in as more of a 5-tech defensive tackle or 5-tech defensive end. With the Goldman sitting out a couple years back, he was now moved back to nose tackle. So I thought he'd get more money. I thought he would get a bunch more money on the market, closer to the Roy Robertson Harris deal. At that money, I would have liked to see the Bears bring him back, just to kind of be depth on the D line. But again, Ryan Poles wants to go in a different direction. He was kind of a tweener fit. He wouldn't have actually been a good 3-tech. He wouldn't actually have been a good nose tackle, more of a guy that kind of, spelled both spots. So I think with him going on to the Raiders, they're going to give him, one job. He'll have a chance to learn and grow at that spot. He's still relatively young. And like you said, he's a 5th-round pick. So I think the Bears got, good production from him, with his draft spot. And then who knows, the comp pick situation could play an effect and the Bears could get something back in that way.
I completely forgot about that, Lester. Whoever in 2020 decided that with Goldman opting out, Nichols was going to be the nose was just ridiculous. I'd forgotten about how often he got moved around on the defensive line. He should have just been a defensive end. That would have made a lot more sense for him.
Yeah.
More Chuck Pagano stuff. All right. So that's what I had planned for this show. So Any final thoughts on what you think the Bears should do in free agency, where they're at, or what projects you're working on? Robert, what's up with you? I'm
waiting to see how things unfold in free agency. Certainly watching draft players. A lot of turmoil at my primary job. So hopefully are going to shake free and be able to actually create some cool stuff. But I have to mention that the Bears signed one of my guys again, DeAndre Houston Carson, who is a really good dime backer and a spry second safety. So he's not somebody that I'm going to. He's got
something you say about an old
coverage.
Person. So I don't know.
Look, he's somebody that I really trust after watching him in coverage space. That pre-throw, he does a really good job of taking great angles and taking stuff away. Now, where is Eberflus going to put him? I can't say, because that nickel corner position is an extremely different position in a Desai type defense to this type defense, where you really want somebody who's more of a do-it-all player than you would normally think out of the nickel. But he's a good special teamer. He's a great option at second safety. He's a coverage guy in a coverage league. And I'm excited to see that Poles brought him back, because he's whenever we see these Super Bowl runs, we see depth guys have to step up. Even going all the way back to 2018, where it looked like Sherrick McManus was suddenly playing the best football of his career, and it felt like maybe the stars were aligning. And Houston Carson's one of those guys where seeing him come back, seeing Jesper Horsted come back is like a nice. I kind of like those guys.
You know, I want to circle back to something Robert said earlier about the linebacker spot, you know, being a bit of a mess, and that's part of it's going from a 3-4, base to a 4-3 base, But Ryan Poles, pre-free agency, he actually signed a couple guys for depth: Noah Dawkins, Joe Thomas. These are guys that have been in the league for a few years each. They're really good athletes, a lot of special teams experience. So these guys, at least they're coming in and they have the bottom of the depth chart. Some guys that they can trust. So I think they are still going to look for another starter. I think that guy's not on the roster right now. And then let's really quick talk about Patrick O'Donnell is now a Packer. So the punter.
Great hair, big contract, average punter. I mean, not worried about it. Again, no. Good looking dude, great head of hair. I'd give a lot of money for that head of hair. But when Ryan Pace leaves with that beautiful head of hair, what's the point of keeping Pat O'Donnell? I'm not worried about it.
We lost Jay Cutler's hair. We lost Ryan Poles' hair. We lost Pat O'Donnell's hair. We're not doing well at the hair front, but hopefully we can get some wins.
Pat Manley, he had great hair too.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I shaved my head, a few months ago. I've embraced the bald, but it is. It still doesn't mean that I don't appreciate when someone has a good head of hair. I'm not worried about Pat O'Donnell. That's fine. Lester, what's going on at the site? Are any projects that you're working on?
Just free agency. I mean, everything is focused on free agency, but we still do have a lot of draft stuff going on. Raul, our newer writer, just had his wide receiver rankings drop today, which should be interesting to Bears fans, because they're going to get a guy probably in that second round. So take a look at that. Jacob has some stuff coming out too for the draft. So even though it's a lot of free agency talk right now, we'll still have that draft covered as well.
Yep. So reminder, we are going to do a live stream on day 2 of the draft, not day 1 of the draft, because the Bears are not picking on day 1. And if they do, then that is going to throw a little bit of a wrench in our day 2 plan. But on day 2, they have currently right now 3 picks. And so we are going to do that. We're going to be on the whole time. We're going to be talking all things Bears, all things draft, all things probably a lot of wide receiver talk, right? We'll bring some people in. We'll cycle some people in throughout. I'll be there all night. Robert will be there all night. We'll live stream the recording of our podcasts where we do the quick hits on the draft. We've got a lot of stuff planned. It's going to be a lot of fun. So hang out with us then. I am going to, I talked about the fan podcast series that I'm going to start doing some research on here. I'm also thinking about doing a series of exit interviews with the players that are leaving, because I think it's interesting trying to put an initial historical stamp on where these guys fit in Bears history, because we lost some pretty significant players to the history of the Chicago Bears this year with this new regime, and I think that it'd be an interesting time for an analysis here. So that's what I'm working on. Stick with us. We'll keep coming back to you all off season. Thanks for this one. Until then, bear down. Cool.
Nice.
What do we got for Q&A?
So first I'll start by saying, John, John DeLaTalia, I saw what you were saying about how historically second-round rookie wide receivers don't even break 800 yards. So I agree with you. I don't actually think the Bears are looking for wide receiver 1 in free agent or in the draft. It's Mooney. I mean, as uncomfortable as I think that's going to make people, they're going to probably try to run a Z-focused offense, and I think it's just a matter of finding an X that can hold water. If you can get that X receiver, say it's George Pickens, say it's Christian Watson, that can block well and pick up 600 yards, 500 yards, the receiver room gets better and at least helps or gives Mooney the space that he needs to be the intermediate threat where I think he and Justin Fields want to live, while guys like Pringle and St. Brown can stretch the field from there. But that's just my 2 cents. What I was going to leave you with, Jeff, if you wanted to, do you think the Packers Adams trade is good for the Bears or is bad for the Bears?
I'm happy he's out of the division, and he is a dominant player, and he is so good, and he's young enough that he would really torture the Bears for quite a while yet. Even if it was in a rebuilding thing, they would still have the top wide receiver in the game. So they get rid of him for a nice return. Don't get me wrong, but in a way, none of it's proven. I mean, draft capital is nice, but that draft capital has to turn into picks. So could it end up hurting the Bears in the long run? Sure, but Adams is so good. The chances that they're going to get, the best wide receiver in the league out of those picks, no, that doesn't worry me as much. So I'm happy. I'm happy he's gone.
Yeah, real quick about the whole X receiver thing. I think that's a little overstated. I mean, in the NFL for the last several decades, your X is not the big tall guy that starts off on the line of scrimmage. You're moving that guy all around the offense anyway. The X, the Z, the slot. Oh, you're a slot, you're an X, you're a Z. Okay, but they're going to move them all over the place anyway. There is no such thing as, like in the old day, this is the flanker. That doesn't really exist anymore. They'll move these guys wherever they go. They'll find a matchup they want wherever they go, like a guy like with Adams with Green Bay. He played everywhere. If the matchup wasn't good on the outside, they put him in the slot. Good receivers will eat no matter where you put them, and that's what the Bears want to do with this offense. So, again, I like having the idea of different body types. I think that helps, a smaller, quicker guys, about bigger guys. But as far as, you're an X, you're a Z, you're a slot, doesn't matter. Play where you want to play. Let's go.
Totally. If anything, Lester, the real reason that I focus on it is for what you said, body types. I think it's not that Mooney has to be a Z. It's that I think he's getting most of his production out of a Z. It takes a special player. You pick Davante Adams for the guy who can play all the spots. I don't necessarily want to put Mooney at the backside of an attack where the X would normally play, or the front side, now that I think about it, so that he has to face a bunch of press coverage. If I could choose, I would either start him in motion or a little off the line so he can release however he wants to. And that's really all I'm going for here. It's not they need an X receiver because they need a top 10 receiver. That's not as much the point as I think that you need to have an X receiver that can basically shield Darnell Mooney from having to play that press coverage role that I think he rules. I mean, frankly, I think the Bears fans are almost forgetting to give their 1,000-yard receiver credit here. Like, there is a point where we say to ourselves, we're not talking about a 700-yard guy. We're talking about a team that I don't think broke 3,700 yards passing, and he still managed 1,000 yards. So
that's so pitiful when you say it out loud like that.
Right? Like,
Eric Kramer still has the mark. Let's go.
We get it. Mooney probably got over targeted. Like, that there's an aspect of that his yards per target wasn't phenomenal. But in an offense where hopefully the Bears can pass for 4,500 yards one of these daggum years, you would think that Mooney could be a pretty productive receiver in that offense.
Gerald, Bears in Hawaii guy, asked Linderbaum or Olave at 39. Look, I'm biased because I have a piece of paper from the University of Iowa. I grew up a Hawkeye fan, and I love it. I love the idea of the Bears having a center from Iowa. There's just something beautiful about that. So it'd be very hard for me to pass up Linderbaum, but I think that a guy like Olave it makes so much sense to pair with Fields because they have a connection already, and you've seen that trend all around the league that I think you'd have to go with the wide receiver there. But I just, it's a shtick. I mean, it's one of those things that I'm just leaning into because the Bears do need a good center. They need a center of the future. Get him in to pair him with Fields now. If they want to bring in a guy like Treader, who's like this really great experienced guy, I love that idea. You want to bring in a young guy that looks like he can be a stud. I love that idea, right? Like just something that makes sense. Lucas Patrick isn't probably the guy that's going to be here for 3 years or 5 years, or whatever. I want somebody who's going to really build that connection with Fields, but I also want that in the wide receiver core too. So there's, a lot of holes in the wall, not enough spackle. Lester?
I want to real quick talk about Ryan Bates. We mentioned him in the show earlier. The Bears have a visit with him coming up this coming up week, and he's a guy from the Bills. There was some comments on our Facebook page asking about him. He's a restricted free agent. But the Bills gave him a tender, which is a right of first refusal offer. So there is no draft pick compensation going back if the Bears do to sign him or he gets signed by someone else. But he's a younger player. I think he had 4 starts last year for the Bills. He's very versatile. He could play guard. He could play tackle. So he's a guy that could fit into the Bears' plans. And if you do go after him, you're going to offer him a deal. But now the Bills have a chance to match that. If the Bills match that, then he stays in Buffalo. If they don't and he goes to Chicago, the Bills get nothing in return. They just lose a player.
Mm-hmm. I know one thing, Jeff, that you mentioned that I didn't think about. Like, things have been hectic enough for me that I've just had to rely on what other people will tell me outside of like half of a game that I caught of Ogunjobi. But I assumed that Lucas Patrick had more center experience than like a start or 2 in the eyes of Packer fans. No. So if he's the depth guy that I thought he was in the first place, pre-presser, which seems to have cemented a whole bunch of people's perspective, then yeah, I think the door is plenty still open. One thing that I think is scary to think about that I'll just mention it, right? Nobody wants to talk about tanking. I don't want to talk about tanking. This is an evaluation year, but the Bears' current pick that they gave the Giants is within the top 10. If they wanted to add like the dude at receiver that recently we've seen the Vikings and obviously the Bengals add that has put their offenses over the top in some capacity, a season of evaluating Justin Fields and losing could land that pick. So I wonder whether this receiver room it's about, or I feel like this year is more about adding capability, so to speak. We forget sometimes just how poor I think that Bears offensive line was last year as soon as Jenkins went down, right? Where suddenly you were starting a 39-year-old who turned in a way better season than anybody expected Jason Peters to. But Peters, white hair, who underperformed, Mustipher, Daniels, who I thought was, you get the idea. I just want to see the Bears establish that capability, that foundation, that floor. And hopefully they sign an offensive lineman or 2 so that we don't have to worry about it.
It's coming. It's coming. They're going to get another guy. You need another guy. You can't go into the draft with needs. You got to fill your needs now, and I think the Bears will do that. Ryan Poles is, like I talked about at the top, I like his approach. He's waiting. They have still not signed a cornerback. You have to sign at least 2 corners, because you have no nickel, you have no CB2. So you got to get a guy. Ryan Poles didn't wait. The market's coming to him. Free agency is not even a week old now. So there'll be guys coming, and I think one of those will be a lineman. I think a receiver, obviously corners, linebacker. I mean, there's a lot of holes in this roster. The Bears only have, I think, 50 guys under contract. So it's coming.
What's happening here?
I'm trying to do TG3. If anything, the Bears not rushing to cornerback makes me think that maybe they actually like Thomas Graham more than we realized. Again, does that mean he's great? No, but it might mean that in a year where they know they're not prioritizing defense, that they may think he's good enough to just give him a trial year. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
And I love JB. What the hell is happening here with the T?
I was trying to figure out how to make a G with my hand. I was like, do I have near?
Well,
is what he's doing here.
What you're saying doesn't make sense. Like I was like, what is happening?
G3.
We get it. No, he's a good player. I think he's in the mix for something. I don't think you count on him. I think, whether they think he can be a starter or not does not stop them from going out and getting a starter who can actually start, who has done it in the past. I think it's coming. Has to be coming because you can't count on that guy, and you can't count on Vildor. You can't count on Duke Shelley. So add to the depth. If one of those young guys step up, great. That's awesome. That's good for the franchise. But you have to have a better option in place that the last guy did not do.
A couple of comments I just want to run through here. First of all, Jan, thanks for showing up from Germany. That's pretty awesome. Evan says someone dig EJ out of the film room. Need the man's takes. I mean, I try to be respectful to the man's process, and we record when he's available. So, I get it. We will get some shows here, but right now it's free agency focused, but I appreciate that comment. Thomas Booker out of Stanford for 3 techniques. So Robert, you can add him to your watch list if you haven't already. Let's see what else we got here. Got some nice comments from both Facebook and YouTube. So appreciate everybody watching this from there. Some nice things said here. Looks like you guys are kind of talking to each other, which is great. Chicago East with Trubisky, Daniels, and Anthony Miller, and someone called it Mitchburg. Oh boy! All right, good luck, Pittsburgh, with all that. And Adams trade yielded similar compensation to the Mac trade. I don't know about that. They got a 1 and a 2, right, from Adams.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a good move for everybody, but I think it's also. Everybody includes Chicago. Getting Adams out is good.
It's very interesting, though, that it came out that the Packers offered him more money, and he wanted to go to Raiders. He wanted to play with his buddy Derek Carr.
Right.
How much does Aaron Rodgers and his whole drama factor into Adams saying, "I'm getting tired of this stuff. I want to go somewhere else. I want to get paid, play with a guy I know,
who's got years in the league,
years left,
not Josh McDaniels coming in to it's like a lot of excitement, right? I always wonder about when these guys come out and they start saying, the Packers really tried and they offered more money and all. What's
is that a
really
spin? Yeah,
because those guys do that for the access. They do that so they can get that inside information. I mean, some of the disgusting tweets from Schefter that came out like that were basically just copy and pasted from an agent so that he could get a scoop. That's what that job is. I mean, I'm not even trying to criticize what they do because I think that's the grime and the dirt that they cover themselves with in exchange for the access. It's icky. Like it's dirty. And so a lot of times when you read this stuff or these guys go on and do those 30-second spots and spout this stuff, you're like, okay, how? They offered more overall money, but not guaranteed money. That, what was it that you think that is that you can make that talking point? Or is it just an outright lie? Like, well, we talked about it, but we didn't actually offer it. I'm not there with that. I'm not going to just give it a pass. There's so much in this league that I just don't believe on first blush because it's a spin factory. And this is, in many ways, this is like politics. And you're trying to save face and look good. And look at how much Trubisky stock went up this offseason. And he did nothing last year to change the player that he is from last year, right? And last year, I said, he's going to go to Buffalo. He's going to back up. I mean, I called it all. I called the year, the money, the destination. And what changed? Like he survived the year and now he's going to be the presumed starter at Pittsburgh. Like it's so much of it is narrative and what you can make of it. And that's interesting, but you just can't believe everything that's said. I don't buy it out of Green Bay. I just
we'll have to wait for the Last Dance documentary that they do about last season.
The 30 for 30.
The 30 for 30 Last Dance.
Yeah. The clarified butter and the Green Bay Packers.
It actually could be pretty enthralling. Just
sure. No, I'd watch it.
That would be great. Speaking, JB, I don't want to pivot too hard because I agree with you that there's a lot of this stuff. I've seen it. A friend of mine who will go unnamed turned my eye onto a certain Senior Bowl coordinator's similar habits in terms of he'll get certain tweets out that seem as if they are direct from a school, but I don't know. I can't confirm anything, and I don't want to make any statement other than there seems to be something there. But while you're on the topic of Schefter, a whole bunch of breaking news happened in the last 15 minutes.
Okay, let's do it. What do you got? I haven't looked.
Rasul Douglas agreed to an extension with the Green Bay Packers, so that's going to be a 3-year deal worth $21 million up to $25.5 million max. So that's the UDFA corner getting signed, and then the Rams and Matthew Stafford finalized a 4-year, $160 million extension that includes $135 million guaranteed. So the small town Texas boy, that's a joke. If you don't know where Matt Stafford comes from, is like gets absolutely monstrous money. And then overall, I can't help but think after the last couple days that if Justin Fields is successful, and gosh, we all hope he is, wow, his extension will be expensive. I mean, just imagine Herbert's money, just imagine Burrow's money. I don't want to make this sound like it's a bad thing. Like, I'm excited, but it's more quarterback money has gone from linearly going up to just exponentially going up. It is exploding.
It's like the GDP of a mid-sized city. You buried the lead, though. The Cleveland Browns traded a quarterback.
I was just going to leave that alone.
Case Keenum's on the move.
Oh, there it
is. Browns are sending veteran Case Keenum to the Bills for a 7th-round draft pick.
He's the new Mitch Trubisky in Buffalo. That's good for him. Next year, it'll be Case Keenum agent pushing the narrative that he's a new player. He's going to get the starter money somewhere. Nice.
I can't help but wonder, though, JB, because I feel like your point didn't actually get spoken to, if truly Mitch Trubisky is just a benefit of circumstance, because nothing promotes somebody's value quite like teams needing a quarterback and there just not really being any other options. Like, don't get me wrong. Maybe people are still really sold on Kenny Pickett, but I think between the Senior Bowl process and the Combine process, the people are really cocking their heads going, I don't know who to take. Like, who's going to sell? Who are we going to sell to season ticket holders? It sounds so silly, right? But in the business of football, you can't just roll in with Sam Ehlinger. You know what I mean? You can't just trot out Curtis Painter unless you're being really blunt about wanting Andrew Luck. Like, you have to have an option. That's how the Colts ended up with Phillip Rivers and Carson Wentz, and then they traded Carson Wentz. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I want the best for Mitch. I really do. If anything, I think that there are going to be a lot of Bears fans that are going to be paying a lot of attention to whether Mitch suddenly succeeds with now Mike Tomlin and Matt Canada, who's under a lot of fire. But who knows? I can't help but think that he's like a lot of players that are 6-year veterans, going to look pretty much the same as he did when he was a 4-year veteran, because most of the time that's how these guys are.
It'll be interesting with Matt Canada. I think he'll put him on the move. I think he's going to do some interesting stuff. I think Matt Canada is probably excited that he has somebody that's not a statue, that can only throw, 10 yards downfield. I mean, watching the Roethlisberger offense, it is amazing that the Steelers were able to win as many games as they can. And what's interesting is
still can't throw more than 10 yards downfield, but
accurately, he can throw it that far, but I don't know
how
accurate it is.
Now I see.
Yeah. We'll see. I'm again, I know a lot of Steelers fans, they're undergoing a transition from, Hall of Fame quarterback who was a shell of himself the last couple of years, but still, like, they have to transfer that over. It could work. It's a good infrastructure. There's good coaches. It's a good building that, they're going to have a deep roster because they normally do. And it'll be interesting. It'll make Steelers games worth watching, even though I think they're going to battle for the bottom of the division there, because that division's loading up. Everybody's talking about the West, but the North's sure pretty good there too. But that's probably a good time to call it. What do you guys think?
Sounds good.
All right. I appreciate everybody joining us. Had a lot of fun. Again, we'll keep doing this. We will definitely be day 2 of the draft. Keep saying it. But we're going to keep on that, because that's going to be a big event for us. But we'll check back in anything that happens here in the future. Until then, thanks guys. Really appreciate it. Bear down.
Bear down.